Welcome to the Gulf Injustice podcast. I'm Radha Stirling, and tonight we're going to be discussing the case of Danielle Jeffries, an American woman who's facing imprisonment in Dubai. Hello everyone, welcome to our podcast, Gulf Injustice. Today we're going to be talking about a Miami woman who's been detained in Dubai for starting her own accountancy business. Now, Miami accountant Danielle Jeffries, who's 58 years old, is the latest American to face the Dubai justice system. She's been sentenced to prison, a hefty fine, and deportations for crimes she didn't commit. Now, after a 25-year-long career in finance, Danielle wanted some international experience. Dubai looked like a good market and an interesting challenge. So in 2015, after quite a bit of consideration, she packed her bags and headed to the desert city. She started out working in a local accountancy firm owned by an Australian woman, but she had the goal to start her own practice. Now, a couple of years passed and she decided to make her dreams come true. She gave notice to her employer and hired a public relations officer who in Dubai is responsible for administrative issues such as starting your own business. That's someone who you would employ to do the admin and paperwork for you. She hired the PRO to apply for her trade license and investor visa that she needs to switch from her employment status. But expats need to be aware that they're going to be held criminally responsible for any mistakes made by a third party to whom they've issued a power of attorney. Danielle had advised the PRO on exactly what she needed, but told him to submit any applications to the government after she left her employment. Or perhaps overzealously, or to lighten his workload, the PRO applied for the trade license prematurely. Danielle's employer had not given a notice of objection certificate, which is needed to apply for a trade license. Danielle was actually brought down to the police station to be questioned. Her PRO admitted at the time to police that he had applied for the trade license in advance and without Danielle's knowledge. At this point, Danielle was actually released. She was given her passport back and thought nothing more of the issue. But then things became convoluted. The PRO changed his story and now accuses Danielle of having actually created the NOC document, an allegation that she adamantly denies. Danielle's former employer acknowledged in an earlier email, in fact, that the PRO was responsible for the forgery. The subsequent civil and criminal cases appear to have been filed against Danielle to prevent her from starting her own company, something Danielle feels may have been racially motivated. How will the city attract entrepreneurs and investors, expat workers with skills when they can be jailed without evidence, then detained in the city indefinitely with no permission to work, no permission to leave? Now, in Danielle's particular case, the US Embassy has been very quiet and very inactive so far, so we're going to put a lot more pressure on them. But we're also writing to the US State Department to recommend that they review and increase their warnings to US citizens. Right now, we're seeing a lot of Americans being caught up in a foreign system that is providing no access to fair trials, very expensive legal representation, where people are being forced to sign confessions. There's a whole list of issues with the UAE. And the US State Department absolutely needs to warn travellers about the real risks of visiting the UAE, and that's for tourists, expats, investors, and entrepreneurs. David Oliver, a US national, was detained in Dubai, and it was only after diplomatic intervention and a press campaign that he was finally released. Now, he was detained over a civil debt matter. Then we've had Melissa McBurney, who was detained because of false allegations from a man who was actually sexually harassing her. Now, it's only due to public outrage that both of these cases were brought to a swift end. But it shouldn't take us to go to the press and for diplomatic intervention to happen to secure the safety of foreign nationals. What we need to see are changes happening to the UAE legal system, and that's only going to come with foreign government pressure. Now, we've seen the UAE actually attack a US-registered yacht in international waters that held a US citizen and Princess Latifah. Now, this was an attack against a US vessel, and nothing seems to have been done to discipline the UAE for that belligerence and that increasingly defying behaviour. And now we're seeing lawsuits being taken out against prominent Emiratis for hacking of US citizens, for death threats and all sorts of abuses against US nationals. Now, we really do need to see the US government stepping up, and particularly in this case, this is Danielle Jeffries, as I've just touched on. Danielle Jeffries went to the UAE to start an accountancy firm, and she's ended up in a Middle Eastern system where she feels that she's been subject to racism, that she's definitely not going to get a fair trial as a woman and a black woman, and where the US government has offered very, very little help, actually really none. So what we need to see is the US authorities actually sticking up for her right now. That's Marco Rubio in Florida. We need our ambassadors on the ground in the UAE engaging in diplomatic conversations with UAE authorities, with their counterparts, as we've seen other embassies do, as we've seen the British Foreign Office do, as we've seen Canada do, and Australia. Now, Danielle Jeffries seemingly has been abandoned by the US government, and they really need to step in on behalf of their citizens or otherwise stop encouraging them to visit the country. So now we're just going to invite Danielle on our show and hear from her directly about what she's been going through. Okay, so hi Danielle, thanks for joining us today. We've just been talking about your case, and you've been actually stuck in the UAE for how long now?
I have been stuck. Well, my passport has been blocked for over a year now. For over a year. My mother is deeply concerned. My mother will be 93 years old in October. I'm very upset because I have not been able to see my mom since this all took place. It's been 3 years since I've seen my mother. We're very, very close. I just spoke to her a few days ago, and my mother, you know, she's a very strong person, but, you know, I am her daughter and she's concerned, and she had been crying. You know, who wants their 92-year-old mom?
I mean, that's heartbreaking. Yeah, when you're talking about a 93-year-old mom, you know, on the other side of the world, and especially in these times of coronavirus and everything that's going on, it's just even more traumatic for the families. And that also adds weight to you, because you're not just worried about yourself and what might happen to you in Dubai, but you're worried about your mum. Are you going to be able to help her if she needs it? Are you going to be there for her?
Exactly.
Especially at 93 years old, you know, it's devastating not to be able to see her when you want to.
It's very devastating. And honestly, you know, when I kept this from my mother for as long as I could. And, you know, as soon as she found out about it, I could feel my anxiety level escalate.
Oh, it's a mother's worst nightmare, isn't it? Their child potentially facing prison in a foreign jurisdiction. I mean, it's not just the US, it's the Middle East. And of course, that's even more frightening for most people.
And shocking, because, you know, she raised me, so she knows what type of a person I am. Yeah. So my mother she's in shock. The only thing I did was start a business. I ran into trouble because I engaged another professional who had been referred to me, who appeared to be someone that could be trusted, especially, you know, in light of what they do for a living. I engaged this PRO to process my trade license. Yes. And unfortunately, he cut corners. You know, he broke the rules, you know, and told me all along that my license was processed legally. The only reason why I engaged him was because I wanted to be compliant.
Well, he's a licensed professional. He's a local. He's going to, you know, he's an experienced person. He's a popular service provider. You employed him. Yes. You trusted him. Of course, giving a power of attorney in this situation is natural. You didn't do anything unusual. And you
I did not.
You relied on him to do the right thing. And I know that you've been in touch with a few government officials in the US. So you've been in touch with Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, is that right?
Yes, Frederica Wilson.
Yeah, okay. And she was in touch with the UAE ambassador to the US. And I was just having a look at this earlier. So she contacted him, and his advice was simply to pay the fine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yes.
obviously you can't pay that. The prison sentence wasn't even mentioned or discussed. Has the US government done anything else to assist you?
No. They sent me a list of lawyers. That is the extent of the support that I have gotten from the U.S. government. They've given me a list of lawyers to choose from. And, that's it.
And did that surprise you? Would you have expected more support from the US government?
Yeah, I was pretty shocked. I was pretty shocked. Yes.
Yeah. And I understand you contacted Marco Rubio as well, who's your rep in Florida.
That's right. He's the senator, and his office was contacted, and now my Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, she did, as you stated, she wrote a letter to the UAE ambassador to the United States. She did do that. Yeah. Marco Rubio's office just gave me the pat response. Sorry, basically, we can't help you. And referred me to a list of lawyers.
Yeah. I mean, that's been quite surprising for a lot of people in trouble in foreign countries over the years, is they would expect that if they're arrested, they thought they'd get a lot more support than they did. They didn't think they'd just be met with a list of local lawyers. They thought the government would, at least in cases of injustice, where you haven't committed a crime, where you haven't, and you haven't been allowed access to justice, you haven't had a fair trial, the police haven't taken your statements correctly, or there's been some sort of miscarriage of justice, you would expect at that point that your foreign government is going to get involved and support you. How can they stand by and let this happen?
That's the surprising part to me, because, there are several, more than a few Americans in this part of the world. And the perception is that you're safe here on every level, and so I really just find it shocking that no one from the consulate or the embassy is stepping forward on my behalf. My Senator Marco Rubio is not going out of his way, to help me. And I find it shocking and very, very sad.
So, I mean, that's the other issue with the UAE is that, a mere allegation is sufficient to secure a conviction against someone, and that conviction can follow them around for life. And, I mean, this is a conviction that can affect your career back in the US. You might have to report it to your accounting authorities. It's devastating for people who are in legal, accounting and professional positions. And also, I mean, we see this with drugs cases as well. So you can imagine when someone's convicted of using drugs, even though the evidence points in the opposite direction, that can really affect their ability to even travel anywhere in the future. A lot of countries won't let people convicted of drugs even get a visa into their country. So the problem is that foreign countries are actually respecting the judgments made in the UAE. So we're respecting their criminal law, we're respecting their convictions, we're taking, if someone's convicted there, we're actually taking that seriously, and it's affecting their career, it's affecting their reputation. The media is reporting on these cases. Oh, well, they were found guilty of a crime in the UAE. They're reporting that in the media, especially if they're a prominent person, and it's having real drastic effects. So this is something that if the UAE wants to attract those tourists and investors and entrepreneurs like yourself, how can they continue to do this? They have to change. And they can change, they can start with your case actually by intervening, seeing that this has been a case of injustice and the US authorities should help with this, and they should be discussing it with their counterparts in the UAE. And what we need is that intervention to happen, to see that this unjust conviction has taken place, overturn it and leave you to be free to return home.
Yes, and that ultimately that is, I want to go home, but at the same time, I want justice.
Well, thanks very much, Danielle. It was great to catch up with you, and I really hope that we can get you home soon, that the US does intervene in your case, and that the UAE actually takes a little look into your case files and sees that there's been an injustice or perhaps an error made and that can easily be corrected, and that you can be reunited with your 93-year-old mum back in Florida. So we have my colleague Shaheed with me today, and you heard my interview with Danielle. What do you make of it?
Yeah. Well, it's really an outrageous thing that's happened to her, and I think that it's not getting the attention that it should be getting. And I think that there's an aspect of it that is being overlooked, which is, and she said it in the interview, that she's really being punished for having tried to start her own business. And it really does raise a question as to whether or not we're talking about a racially motivated desire to prevent her from starting her own company. Because, I mean, from the conversations that I've had with her, the understanding between her and the employer, although, okay, now she's dealing with a different employer than originally hired her. But her understanding was, and the way her work was set up with that company really was designed for her to move towards starting her own business. I mean, she was really operating in a kind of not a freelance way, but her clients were her clients, you know? And she was just basically operating under the umbrella of this company, but more or less working independently. So she was really, already on the track for starting her own firm. And that was the whole reason that she went to Dubai. And there's no doubt that she made that clear to her employer, that this was just a way for her to sort of enter the market, enter the industry in Dubai, and work towards starting her own company. As long as she was benefiting her employer, they had no problem with her more or less operating independently. But as soon as she wants to go off on her own and start something, they make this very vindictive case against her.
Why go to the extent? I mean, if this kind of thing happened in the UK and someone had, for example, submitted this document 2 weeks early or 3 weeks early, which is all we're talking about, would that turn into a police case? Would her boss have taken this to the police in Australia? Absolutely not. Only the fact that they can and that's open to them, have they done that in the UAE, which is really concerning.
On the face of it, it's absurd. As she said in the interview, and it's absolutely right, at this stage in her career, it's completely implausible that she's going to start forging documents and putting her whole reputation on the line. Like I said, on the face of it, you know that she is not responsible for this forgery precisely because she hired someone else to do the paperwork. It doesn't make sense that you would now accuse her of forging paperwork that she hired someone else to do in the first place.
I mean, this one's really obvious too, because the police know that she didn't forge the document. They've already investigated it, and they've found who forged the document, who stamped the document, and they know that it wasn't her. So how is this able to get all the way through to a conviction? And that's, I mean, you mentioned prejudice before. So yes, there may have been prejudice coming from her accusers, but also the Jordanian man who was the PRO who allegedly forged this document. He might have seen her as easy prey. And then we have the police themselves, who have obviously taken this all the way through to prosecution, all the way through to the courts and to an almost automatic conviction. Now, is that racially motivated?
I mean, we really have to ask the question. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of it that would indicate to me that there's a racial motivation here on the part of the employer for making the case in the first place, when there's no reason. I mean, it's not as if there aren't other accountancy firms in the UAE that she's already in competition with. So there's, to say that it's just because Danielle is going to be a competitor, that doesn't even make sense, because there's already competitors in the market. It's a wide open market for accountancy firms in the UAE. Obviously, Danielle has a particular expertise. She's particularly qualified. So yeah, she's going to be a healthy competitor for her. But to make this vindictive case when you know that she's not guilty of the offense, you know perfectly well that she's not guilty. You've even said as much in an email to Danielle. You know that she's not guilty. What is the motivation? If the PRO decided later to change his testimony they would weigh that against all of the other available evidence of his guilt and say, no, sorry, you don't get to change your testimony. We know perfectly well that you forged it. We have all the evidence that you forged it. Now, after the fact, you don't get to change it. But then you have this problem in the UAE where they just like to make cases. You know, it's beneficial to the police the more cases they can make. It's more beneficial to the prosecution the more cases they can make, the more convictions they can have. It doesn't matter if you're innocent or guilty. It doesn't matter if they have evidence. If they can do it, they'll do it just because it's good for their career.
Career advantage, yes. And,
precisely.
And we don't know what kind of relationship that this PRO had with the police. Clearly, it was a very good one if he was able to change his testimony so easily. But then another case was taken and he ended up getting convicted himself. So I suppose he also potentially dug himself in too deep in this one. And Danielle managed to expose the fact that he was the guilty party. But it didn't save her.
Well, I mean, the police will be willing to work with you if you can get someone else in trouble along with you, but it won't necessarily get you off the hook. They're interested in as many convictions as they can get. So if you're willing to, you know, if you want to change your testimony in a way that will allow them to arrest and convict another person, they're willing to make that exception. You know, they're willing to allow that, but it's not going to get you off the hook. They'll still, I mean, and this is what they use all the time.
Especially in the drugs cases, we see this
precisely
all the time. People are under the false impression that if they give names from, you know, they might just open their phone and give the entire address book, just thinking that that's going to get them off the hook. But they simply go and arrest those people and charge them as well. And you, as the snitch, haven't got anything out of that deal at all.
Yeah, you're still going to go to jail. You'll still go to jail. And, you know, and in cases like that, when they really do that, they'll just open up your phone book and see your contacts, and they'll ask you, okay, what about this one? What about this one? What about this one? And most likely, the ones that you as a snitch will be willing to name will be people that you don't really know that well. You know, you'll be willing to accuse someone or set someone up or frame someone as long as they're not a really close acquaintance of yours. You know, and this is probably something that happened with Andrew Neil.
And the toll that it's taken on her on a personal level, it's really unbelievable, and people don't really understand that until they actually talk to someone who's been in this position for a while. And I know Danielle's going through an extremely tough time. She's suffering from depression, and obviously, you know, the toll on her family is incredible, and all over something that she never even did. So it's absolutely heartbreaking. It happens time and time again, and it's got to stop.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for someone like Danielle, who, as I said, is someone who has done everything right in her life. She's done everything that you're supposed to do to be successful, to have a successful career, to have your own business, to do everything. She's done everything that you're supposed to do. She's worked for the biggest firms. She graduated from one of the best schools. She went to the UAE and started working for another company so that she could start her own company. She's done everything according to the book, you know? And then to find herself in this position at this age, at this stage in her career, it's really it's absurd and outrageous that this would happen to her.
I mean, it's almost, this happens so much, and foreigners just don't quite understand how at risk they are. If something like this happens, and Danielle was brought down to the police station and she was interviewed, and she was told that she'd have to stay in the country as a witness against the PRO, and she was given her passport back. But any interaction with the police is a serious risk. And when you can foresee that this type of thing could happen, the slightest interaction makes you want to flee the country. I mean, even being brought down to the police station to be interviewed about someone else's behaviour like this is almost a sufficient warning to a person that they should quickly get out, see how it pans out, and see what might happen. Are they going to get a charge against them? At least they'll be out of the country when it happens. But the thing is, it's so frequent and it is such a grave warning. There's nothing that anyone can really do to prevent being arrested in the UAE. Like you said, Danielle had done nothing. She played everything by the book. She'd done everything right. And there was nothing that she could possibly have done to protect her from what's just happened. The courts, really, I mean, the prosecutors wouldn't be able to take anything through to a conviction if it weren't for the judges ruling on these requests from the prosecutors. So why are the judges giving convictions when there's no evidence in front of them, where it's merely a witness statement. This has to change. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Gulf Injustice. I'm Radha Stirling, and we've been discussing the case of Danielle Jeffries, who we hope to see home in America soon.